Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Western Perspective. I'm Taylor Hanna. Tonight we feature part 1 of our climate interview series exploring political resistance in the fight for climate change and against climate inaction. I was inspired to invoke conversations around this topic after watching the newest climate documentary 2040, directed and starred in by Australian filmmaker Damon Gameau. I sat down with global politics and policy lecturer Dr. Ian Cook to discuss political themes not highlighted in the film, but definitely important in moving forwards towards a climate solution. Set in the present day, the film explores a utopian year, 2040, where we use and implemented technologies that are already available to us, meaning the environmental catastrophe is averted and the world is a much nicer place. This film raised so many good ideas that are unfortunately not receiving as much attention as the dystopian future we're getting ourselves into. For starters, it's not just enough to cease all carbon emissions to zero. We're over a tipping point and on our way to a point of no return. We not only have to reduce emissions but also sequester carbon, removing excess carbon from the atmosphere and storing it. There are various technologies highlighted in the film, most still in their infancy, all promising, encouraging and informative. However, there was a lack of notes on the huge shifts politically and economically to bring many of these solutions to fruition. Political resistance will be the biggest hurdle worldwide in achieving a carbon deficit environment.
Oh, there's no doubt in terms of capacity to generate renewable energy. Australia is got so many possibilities. I mean, partly because it's such a big country, but yeah, we've got the heat, we've got the sun, we've got everything we need to make renewables a reality. And in fact, to sort of really produce pretty much all of our power via renewables. But we're just not seeing enough effort on the parts of governments to promote that.
And do you think that we have a lot of political resistance at the moment?
I think we've got, it's inertia, resistance, it's an unwillingness to address the problem, it's just too hard. There's lots of things going on at the moment, all of them leading to inaction. The next stage is what we call carbon dioxide removal, or negative emissions technologies. They're really expensive, they've been really slow, we don't have made a lot of progress with them. We can buy ourselves some time, maybe get technologies to draw the carbon out. These are big ifs and action needs to be taken tomorrow.
What about incentives for electric vehicles? So sort of, I guess, the big mining companies, oil companies, they're the ones who fund the politicians' pockets. So why would we shift away from that?
I think that's, we hit the nail right on the head in terms of trying to get progress with respect to policies that might affect the interests of the oil companies and or the other extractive industries such as mining. So, there are big problems in terms of trying to make headway here. It's really easy to stoke those sorts of fears if you've got well-funded opposition. And with the mining companies and the other extraction companies, they have massive capacity to influence people to not want change, and they've been doing a very good job. Obviously, the question just becomes one of how much pressure is put on people in government. If they feel they're going to lose their jobs, people get voted out because they're not moving on things like electric cars, they'll move. So, it's very much a case of how much pressure they feel under. And, and as we were sort of discussing, the power of the various lobbies, mean that for the most part politicians are pretty comfortable with inaction. And, until the voters really rise up and say we want electric cars, we want, the capacity to generate our own power, they won't do it.
While Australia's contributions to the total global emissions is quite small in the grand scheme of things, we need to shift our perspective towards a more localised response.
But I think we've got to approach this question a little differently. Rather than looking at national totals, I think we've got to look at per capita totals. And, per head, we have 20 times the carbon footprint of people in some countries.
Is it sort of like each country just shifts the blame to another country?
A lot of people in many of the sort of developing countries, including places like India, like China. And, people in those countries are saying, look, we don't produce as a nation, the amount of greenhouse gases that other countries produce. So they don't see themselves as necessarily under pressure to reduce their production of greenhouse gases. I mean, this is a massive problem that no one's really looking at very closely.
So if we're all bickering all the time, shouldn't we be sort of uniting together as a world to come up with a solution?
So there's nobody bringing everybody together. We have these events like Paris that are, lots of show, but all the analyses are showing that nothing much was done as a result of Paris. Nothing much is being done as a result of Paris. So we've got all this showcasing going on. We've got all this sort of apparent action. We've got no real action, and partly because, as we were saying, everyone's looking at everyone else saying, oh, you should do more. It's mostly you, and, until you do something, I'm not going to do something, and I'll turn up to these sorts of things. But when it comes to my economy and my election, I'm going to run policies that'll win office.
So many young people, they get caught up in sort of expressing their views about climate change because it's trendy, it's the cool thing to be on board with. Do you think that sort of left-wing propaganda has sort of fueled a bit of like a meme culture? Because I feel like everybody just shares things online and they go, haha, that's my bit for climate.
Well, I think certainly there's a sort of sense in which posting or tweeting or something represents political action or represents doing something, and it doesn't. And so a lot of people feel, okay, I've done something, I've tweeted, I've posted, I've maybe even contributed a little bit of money to a campaign here or there, and feel like, okay, I've done my job. And so I think that's part of one of the problems that we're facing, is that it's what needs to be done to address problems and what needs to be done to shift governments is more than tweeting and blogging and being part of a Facebook group and flash mobbing or whatever it is that you want to do. It just none of those things are really going to have lasting impact. Yeah, there's no doubt that the climate movement has been sort of labelled and tarnished with this view that it's a sort of left-wing front organisation, and certainly the left have tried to use it, but it's not.
There are plenty of little things you can do every day to help, but without overarching governmental support, not only to implement new policies and legislations, but to also back technology implementation financially, we won't get there. Do your own research. Find environmental topics that are interesting to you. Form your own conclusions and keep your curiosities ferocious.
I guess in the first instance, they just need to do more research into the state of the environment. That's how I started. I just decided I needed to find out what was going on. The more research I did, the more shocked I was, the more concerned I became, the more clear it was to me that action was required. So just do the research. And
do you think that sort of writing to local MPs is a more effective way that to incite change rather than targeting big Canberra that's really impenetrable?
I think all of them. I think you've got to do everything. I've got to hit at every point you can find. It's not a case of thinking, oh, there's a best strategy here. We've got to use every resource we've got, hit every point we have with as much force as we can. That's, I think, young people's only hope.
It's definitely all a bit overwhelming with how much negative information is put out there, not only through the media, but I guess through social media and just human interaction. Do you sort of think we could progress towards a resolved greener future?
I don't. I'm sorry. I've just submitted a manuscript of a book that's called The Politics of the Final 100 Years of Humanity, 2030 to 2130. And I've been studying this problem now for quite a long time. All those factors that produce political inaction, are just there and very difficult to shift. The problem is so hard to understand and so hard to address. I don't want to be a doomsayer to the extent to which, yes, look, if we got our acts together right now, tomorrow, and started do things, if pressure's put on governments, it's not all over. We can slow things down. It could be catastrophic very quickly, or we could do things that will, give us some time, and maybe we can do more, and maybe we can pull the iron out of the fire. But at this stage, if we're not acting tomorrow, I don't see any real hope, and I don't expect action tomorrow.
And that's Western Perspective for this week. Until next week, Ivan and Danielle, back to you.
Thanks, Taylor. This week's main news again. As the fight for climate justice continues, university students flooded the CBD with feisty signs and catchy chants protesting the government's inaction.
And that's our news for this week. We have the latest on our website and Facebook page.
Until next Sunday after 8, thanks for company. Good evening.
Good night.